Welcome to the Skype Web SDK Fundamentals course. My name is Matthew Proctor and I'll be teaching you how to get started with the Skype Web SDK. This course is made up of 5 sections: an introduction, why the SDK is useful, what it can actually do, a code example, and a summary. Before we start, there's a few things you need access to and an understanding of. Firstly, you need a Lync or Skype for Business account, either on your own network, via a third-party provider, or using Microsoft Office 365. You'll also need a local website on which you can run the code you'll see today, and a basic understanding of JavaScript, jQuery, and HTML, CSS. In this course, we'll be using Visual Studio as a development environment. However, it's not required, and you can use any text editor. The Skype Web SDK is a new set of JavaScript components and HTML controls that enable developers to build web experiences that seamlessly integrate a wide variety of real-time collaboration capabilities. The Skype Web SDK is a framework that lets you add a variety of capabilities to your website, from instant messaging to video conferencing. It is a simple client-side JavaScript library that supports all modern versions of Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, Apple Safari, and Mozilla Firefox. The SDK uses the Lync and Skype for Business platform and works for all versions from Lync 2013 and beyond. Before we dive into any code, let's look at a few reasons why the Skype Web SDK is a useful and, more importantly, powerful framework. The most common and important tasks exposed by the Skype Web SDK are 3 communication methods: connecting to the Skype service, setting your presence or availability, such as online, away, busy, etc., and finally, sending an instant message or IM. But why are these useful? Let's look at 3 brief scenarios. The SDK could be used to build your own live chat for your website, enabling you to communicate with visitors and customers in real time with no additional licensing or software costs. Conferencing, both audio and video, can be easily added to your website. Imagine being able to open a Skype video call with your customers to help close that important sale. Or, for the young at heart, build an interactive application or game that engages your visitors via Skype. For example, I'm working on a port of the classic Infocom text adventure game Zork for Skype. Before a Skype Web SDK project can use any of the modalities available, the application must be able to successfully authenticate a user account with the Lync or Skype for Business service. So what can it actually do? The SDK lets you control the key functions of Skype for Business: the ability to send and receive instant messages, manage your presence and location, provides a method to managing contact lists and groups, as well as lets you initiate audio and video conference calls, all from a single SDK and from within a web browser. Now comes the fun part, a demonstration of how to authenticate using the Sign-in Manager method. The Sign-in Manager is a collection of methods used to sign in and sign out of a Lync or Skype for Business service. The Sign-in method supports OAuth, NTLM, or basic authentication, the latter of which we'll demonstrate shortly. As we attempt to authenticate, we'll show you how to display the current progress, as well as to handle successful or unsuccessful authentication attempts gracefully. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is set up a blank ASP.NET website in Visual Studio. It doesn't need to be ASP.NET, but if we look at expanding it later on with more functionality, it just makes it a little bit easier to start with. So we're calling it Skype Web SDK example. It's just a C# empty web application. Let's go ahead and create that. Now I'm going to create a little subfolder called scripts where I'll put in our useful scripts and style sheets. So away we go. A new folder, scripts. And within that folder we're going to paste some scripts that we have created earlier on. You'll see there's a CSS file in there called index.css. This just contains some basic layout styling that we'll use in our little web page to help make the site look a little bit more user-friendly. We also have the Skype Web SDK, which is a minified JavaScript file. So let's go ahead and create our actual web page itself, just a blank HTML page. We'll call it default.html just for consistency. And within this page, what we're going to do is paste in our header section, which contains references to the scripts that we added earlier. Now we're also going to include jQuery, so a reasonably modern version, 2.1.1. We're now going to paste in our actual HTML content. So what we've got here is a div called sign-in frame, and within this frame we have our username and password text fields. And they're styled using the CSS file that we saw earlier. And we've also got a couple of buttons called sign in and sign out. We'll use jQuery to actually interact with these elements of the page. Down the bottom we also have a div called logging box. I use this because I like to actually see the text output. So here's our web page. Obviously we have our login field, which is an email address, typically for Lync and Skype for Business. We have our password field and our 2 buttons. So what we're now going to do is look at our default.js file. Within this file we'll have our JavaScript and jQuery commands. We'll actually use the Skype Web SDK. What we're going to do is create first of all our little logging code. What this code will do is we'll take a text string from the actual application and append it to the div that was on the default HTML. We're also going to paste in the actual jQuery code. The most important part of the code is where we initialize the Skype for Web SDK application. So we create a new client object. Now within that object we have a sign-in manager, and within the sign-in manager we have a state.changed object. That object will then trigger a function whenever the state of the Skype Web SDK changes. We're now going to use the click event handler on the sign-in button that we saw earlier to actually call the client.signinmanager.signin function. The sign-in function takes 2 properties, the username and password, which we're going to derive using jQuery from the actual HTML form. The sign-in function then returns a true or false based on whether it can actually sign in, and we'll use JavaScript promises to then send the output of this event to our logging box so we know what's actually happened. Finally, we create another click function, attach it to the sign out button, which naturally signs out the client once the user actually presses that button. On the right of our screen you can see our Skype for Business client. This replaces the Lync client. We can see that there's a test user account which we've configured previously and it's currently offline. So going back to our page that we created, all we need to do now is log in. So we enter in our Skype for Business email address and our password and simply click the sign in button. This runs the sign in method. As we can see, it's now enabled that user. So it's used the Skype Web SDK to actually communicate with the Skype servers and enable that account. To log out, I think you can pretty much guess what we're going to say. Click the sign out button. It automatically signs out. So let's have a look at the 3 core functions used in the code example previously. Firstly is the application object. The application object is created by calling the application constructor and is the entry point to the SDK. All operations in the SDK depend on the application object and require that a user is signed in through this object before subsequent methods and properties can be used. The signinmanager.signin function and the signinmanager.signout function are asynchronous methods that return a JavaScript promise object. In the context of Skype for Business, the username that you see here is actually the user's email address or SIP address. These are the functions that are actually used to authenticate the user with the Skype for Business service. Finally, you may have noticed the code was also retrieving the user's display name. In future modules I'll explain this in a little bit more detail. Access to the signed-in user's properties is gained by reading the collection members of the application.personsandgroupsmanager object. The mperson object, which is within the original object, contains a myriad of information including name, location, note, availability or presence, title, email address, and also their photograph. So today we've learned how to simply authenticate to a Lync or Skype for Business service using the Skype Web SDK. Hopefully this will help start you off on your journey to building a Skype-enabled application.